Welcome to everyone. My name is Gabriel Rosenberg, and I am an associate professor of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies and history here at Duke. I chair the Sexuality Studies Advisory Board, and I am the director of graduate studies in GSF. It's my honor to introduce Professor Matt Brim, who will be giving this year's queer theory lecture to honor Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. And before I say more about Professor Brim's work, I want to say a bit more about this event itself. So you are joining us for our annual queer theory lecture in honor of Eve Sedgwick. Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies hosts this annual event to welcome, celebrate, and think alongside the most incisive and provocative scholars in the interdisciplinary field of queer theory in honor of one of its most incisive and provocative critics, that being Eve Sedgwick. As you may know, Sedgwick spent much of her career here at Duke in the Department of English, where she authored field-defining works of queer literary criticism, epistemology of the closet in 1990, and tendencies in 1993. Although she moved to City University of New York in 1997, where she taught until her passing in 2009, she left an indelible mark on this community. In particular, Sedgwick's work helped to establish Duke as an intellectual leader in the critical study of sexuality. Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies hosts this event every year and has done so for more than a decade as both a tribute to Sedgwick and to continue her legacy. The lecture asks leading scholars to not only showcase new research, but ideally to also offer a broader perspective on the state of the field, its past and its future trajectories, as well as to tease those boundaries, writing new itineraries, engaging new audiences, and perhaps fostering new queer publics. In this sense, we ask, maybe sometimes too insistently, what queer theory is and what it might yet become. A question, of course, as this talk will probably note, that discloses some of the thorny political desires that define the field, this institution, my department, and probably what we all do in this room. I'm going to return to that question in just a moment. For now, I want to note that the Sedgwick Lecture is the centerpiece of sexuality studies programming at Duke. The programming covers lectures, workshops, film screenings, and other events, and also supports an undergraduate minor in sexuality studies within gender, sexuality, and feminist studies. All of this activity is oriented towards charting the centrality of sex, sexual identity, and sexual practice to contemporary politics and culture in the United States and around the world. I'm also thrilled that Sexuality Studies and GSF enjoy a close relationship with Duke's Sally Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture at the Rubenstein Library. That center now houses the Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick papers, an archive that I believe as of this spring is now open for research and will make a magnificent resource, I think, for undergraduate courses that are trying to think through queer studies, as well as graduate courses. And basically anyone who cares about queer studies should go and look at the archive. I would also then like to take this opportunity to thank Hal Sedgwick, Eve's longtime partner, whose generous support allows us to record and digitally archive this lecture. And now to the matter at hand. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Matt Brim. He is Professor of Queer Studies in the Department of English at the College of Staten Island, part of the City University of New York, and he holds an appointment in the Graduate Center's Women and Gender Studies MA program. He is the author of a co-edited collection, Imagining Queer Methods with Amin Ghaziani, from NYU Press in 2019, as well as James Baldwin and the Queer Imagination from the University of Michigan Press in 2014. But more recently, he is the author of Core Queer Studies, Confronting Elitism in the University, which was published by Duke University Press in 2020, and has, I think, been rightly heralded as an incredibly important work within queer studies. It was awarded the Working Class Studies Association's 2021 Jack Ryan and Charles Sacre Award, and was also a finalist for the O.L. Davis Jr. Outstanding Book in Education Award presented by the American Association for Teaching and Curriculum. His essays have also appeared in numerous journals, including the Journal of Homosexuality, Women's Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Modern Literature, and he is currently editing two different collections that build on the work begun in queer studies. One, Queer Precarity in Higher Education with Zed Books, Queer Sharing in the Marketized University with Rutledge. Queer Studies is a work that undoubtedly fulfills this lecture's call to investigate queer theory's field-defining boundaries. And as such, Professor Brim is an apposite and exciting choice to deliver it. Poor Queer Studies challenges its readers to understand the classed contours of our field, not just in the abstract terms of symbol, but in the material conditions of the production of our knowledge. When correctly marked, most of what passes for queer studies would be better characterized by those material conditions as rich queer studies, a discursive and scholarly nexus that is increasingly segregated from the pedagogical and practical realities of what Brim notes we should call poor queer studies. Brim is acutely aware that queer studies scholars enjoy nothing better than a bit of self-flagellation over the failure of the liberatory projects in which their scholarship is often rhetorically invested, in which they themselves may be affectively invested. But self-flagellation all too often leads only to a redoubled investment in locating the proper critical object. Indeed, that is the point made astutely by both my colleagues Robin Wiegman and Jennifer Nash here at Duke, who are both in attendance, as well as recently by Kaji Amin, Jules Gill-Peterson, and a number of other scholars working in and through queer studies. Like those scholars, Brim worries about the critical spiral in which we compulsively, and I include myself here, stitch our proper objects to our critical aspirations to renew our optimism that we do justice to our objects through our scholarship. When it comes to critical texts, failure can be animating. Texts circulate. They are traded across the institutional bases of rich queer studies, accelerated, not decelerated, by critique, even self-critique, and converted there into social and intellectual capital for their agents. What is usually left unexamined in that circulation, and what I think is unique in Brim's contribution, are the very material conditions for producing all this critique. Be they tenure lines and research funds, to classrooms filled with eager students who don't work nights, support families, or struggle to afford laptop computers, for the most part. These material conditions, Brim contends, silently define queer studies, the kinds of questions we ask, the stories that we tell, precisely why rich queer studies masquerades merely as queer studies with its richness and its class configuration unmarked. I think that in less capable hands, the failure of rich queer studies to deliver on its critical aspirations might inspire yet another round of disavowals. But Brim is acutely interested in avoiding the spiral. He is less interested in chastening rich queer studies and in inspiring its agents to recognize their material participation in and their enactment of material and practical production of knowledge. That is, he wants to encourage us to find ways to materially and practically support other forms of study. Not just through symbol, not just through rhetoric, and not just through the discourse of our scholarship, but in fact through a material redistribution of resources. Part of that project is simply the work of exploring what poor queer studies is as a pedagogical intellectual project, and this is a major contribution of the book. What are the material conditions for its practice and its liveliness? What are the precedents and antecedents it could claim? What constituencies it can empower, and what it might do distinct from the critical investments of rich queer studies? But it is also the work of marking the unmarked, in this case of locating rich queer studies as a particular rather than universal formation, and thus making the implicit class structure that has defined queer studies more explicit. In light of Brim's invaluable work, it's worth noting something that will perhaps be an uncomfortable recognition for everyone in this audience. Duke University, our program in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, and indeed this very lecture, is the heart of rich queer studies. This lecture is a venue that frequently inspires scholars to articulate their most radical aspirations, but we do not always enact material redistributions that facilitate study in other spaces more accessible to the poor. It is precisely because of this that I invite this audience to consider Brim's analysis, to suspend, if only for the time being, our urge towards our critical disavowal, to put aside our promise to become more radical, less hierarchical, to finally do justice to our object, those are our aspirations, and instead, just for the time being again, to ponder what material solidarity with poor queer studies might in fact involve. I think that's the promise of the book. I suspect it's the topic of the talk. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Brim.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and I appreciate the invitation to be with everybody from the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies to help honor Eve Sedgwick. Special thanks to Gabriel and to the graduate students who took me to lunch today. Thank you to Jennifer Nash for contacting me to visit her class by Zoom last year, grad her class. So I feel like I've been here recently. And thank everybody. First of all, Julie Winmore and Jeremy Boomhauer for getting me here. And thanks for everybody who set up the room and the tech crew who marshaled these resources for us all to have a conversation together. I'm delighted to be here and I appreciate you being here. In this talk, I want to invite you to understand queer studies as, in part, a class-based academic knowledge project, and then to pursue with me some implications of that understanding, including the need to tell the complicated class histories of our work in the field, and to bolster cross-class queer studies relationships through resource sharing. I say in part to build flexibility and even at times contradiction into the study of class reproduction in the academy. Following, for example, working class studies scholar Allison Hurst, who suggests that class cultures add to class reproduction, not just money or structural causes. In this vein, Kiese Lehman, who, by the way, just won a MacArthur, I hope everybody saw that, some Kiese. It's like $800,000, I think.
Yeah.
Before he won a MacArthur, Kiese wrote, he evoked the class, race, gender knots of a campus culture when he writes in his memoir, Heavy, no matter how conscientious, radically curious, or politically active I encouraged them to be, teaching wealthy white boys at Vassar meant that I was being paid to really fortify and make more responsible their power. Elsewhere, however, Ruth Gordon rethreads the expected weaving together of gender, class, and race when she identifies not only community in the midst of hierarchy among her Black women law school professor colleagues, but also a university culture of status worship operating alive and well among that group. She writes, many of us spend our professional lives contesting hierarchy and exclusion, whether on the basis of race, gender, or class. But when it comes to academia, we appear finally to have found a hierarchy we can believe in. Gordon implicitly points us toward recent explorations of the quote-unquote Black elite, as well as Black and Latinx experiences at elite colleges. And so thinking of sources here such as Young, Gifted, and Diverse, Origins of the New Black Elite, and The Privileged Poor by Tony Jack. As these prefatory comments imply, my talk today will draw on queer studies, working class studies, critical race studies, critical university studies, and pedagogy studies. At the intersection of these fields is the analytic that I've been calling core queer studies. And today I'll extend my thinking from the 2020 book by that name. When I say I invite you to understand queer studies as a class-based academic knowledge project, that invitation contains two givens. First, that we can all do it, that we can accept the invitation. And this is because we are all in class relation, because of our status in the academy. We're in class relation to our educational histories, the places we currently work, to the ideas we create, and to each other. The second given is that, this is actually the foundation for the first, whatever else it may be for, today's university is for class and race sorting. Social stratification is an intentional, defining, structural feature of the U.S. Academy. There are all kinds of measures, of the ways higher education reproduces class stratification. You can think in the first two bullet points about students, and the second two about institutions, and the final two about faculty. We can think along with sociologist Anne Mullen, who says we need to ask of students who goes where to college, not just who goes to college, who goes where to college. Poor students are funneled one way, rich students are funneled the other way. We love to make a lot of hay out of the exceptions to that rule. Rich students being funneled the other way, or how they're funneled the other way, is because they're boosted by private school attendance, legacy admissions, the promise of future donations, and niche sports scholarships. And I just want to point to a New York Times article today. The title was "Fencing Can Be Six-Figure Expensive, but It Wins in College Admissions." Niche sports can offer a pathway to elite schools, but those country club sports are rarely played outside predominantly white suburbs. This is today's New York Times. I assume you have fencing here.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. Need fencers? So I am going to be talking about you, but I'm talking about myself too, right? So we're talking about each other, and we have to talk about ourselves in class relation to each other. So you don't have to raise your hand when I ask a question like that, but you may be uncomfortable because class is uncomfortable to talk about sometimes. We can think about institutions, and we can think about the massive resource disparities among them. When we do this, we see that the best schools are resource hoarders, and they brag about that fact. They thrill at the fact that prestige requires exclusion. It is not despite, but because of the wealth of rich colleges that the needle has barely moved on the class composition of their student bodies in the last 10 years, according to the American Talent Initiative. Finally, we can look at faculty in order to understand higher education as a class-based institution, one with deep family ties. Several large-scale studies of the socioeconomic roots of U.S. faculty highlight, to quote Morgan and her colleagues, the social reproduction of the highest levels of academic attainment and scientific influence. Morgan and her co-writers thus ask about the ramifications, these are their words, of high socioeconomic status overrepresentation in the academic workforce and its skewed intersection with race, ethnicity, and class in the United States. What does this overrepresentation have? What result does it have on the type of scholarship that faculty produce and on the scholars they train? That is, what discoveries are not made and what ideas are not developed as a result of academia's historical and current lack of socioeconomic diversity. And you can see here, that childhood income of faculty is about 24% higher. You can see that faculty are 25 times more likely to have a parent with a PhD, and when you get to Ivy Plus schools, that proportion doubles. It's a family business. We think of legacy admissions as a student issue. Legacy admissions is a faculty issue. Finally, sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit. This is, no, that's good, sorry. Because the steeply tiered university world is structured to produce class stratification and race sorting, queer studies must be understood both within and as a field of class relations and contradictions, not unlike those discerned by Ruth Gordon about law faculty. Not merely passively structured by class, queer studies contributes to the stratifying work of the academy. We are implicated, said gay historian Adam Barabay in 1995 of queer studies scholars. A chief claim of core queer studies was to follow up that idea from 30 years ago and lend it specificity in the present. And what I found is that the field of queer studies, though there is lively work across the university world, top to bottom, the field of queer studies has been and is still defined and propelled by the immense resources of precisely those institutions of higher education that refuse to serve representative numbers of poor students, and to hire faculty without high status academic pedigrees. Yet these schools are understood not only to be the best, but to be the queer best. And the well-resourced ideas made there translate directly into the academic formation we call the field. Now, this causes queer anxiety because queer studies commitments are to justice and egalitarianism. But as Kaji Amin tells us, queer studies has an exceptional capacity for selective egalitarianism, a capacity for disregarding its disturbing attachments, in this case, to hierarchy and success. It is quite possible, I think, quite possibly easier to fetishize queer failure than to confront the cost of queer studies success. The cost of queer studies success is somewhat calculable. Though perhaps disquieting, queer studies ideas have price tags. There are receipts, sometimes many, sometimes few, trailing behind every queer book written. I want to be clear, I don't argue that the longer the trail of the receipts, the better the idea. Only that there's a relationship between material resources and the production, prominence, and dissemination of queer ideas in the university. A relationship between resources and field formation. I invite you then with me to tell the material histories of queer studies. What I mean by this is that we need to tell the stories of the class conditions of our work, which include at my college, and I'm sure here, so many resource contradictions. A librarian at CSI just said that they are not able to buy books and have not been able to for years, even pre-pandemic, and have had to cut database subscriptions. At the same time as we are not able to buy books, several times over the past couple of years, we have had individuals who have heard that queer studies happens at CSI, which is already a win for us. We've already left a big hurdle. And they wanted to donate their personal LGBTQ book collections to the college library, philanthropy to the rescue. But the contradiction is that my college library has no resources to visit their houses, itemize their books, cross-check them with our holdings, pay for transportation of the books, process them at the library, and of course, buy materials to shelve them or buy space to store them. In other words, our material conditions are such that we can't afford the philanthropy of others. What is the cost of this and so many other opportunities missed? As these slides suggest, another resource contradiction at my college. We fight hard to get gender-neutral bathroom, and we win, we get them. But down the hall from the gender-neutral bathroom, this is what the men's room looks like. These are urinals covered with garbage bags. They changed those garbage bags by the way.
Oh, that's nice.
We've entered the queer class upside down, where the need for bathrooms that work for everyone is never separate from the need for bathrooms that just work. The hope is that by naming these queer class contradictions, we can make change happen. Our visions for tomorrow are most vital, Bell Hooks tells us, when they emerge from the concrete circumstances of change we are experiencing right now. And I would just add to that, even change for the worse. By the way, I should honor Bell Hooks today as well, since we lost her this past year. As these slides suggest, a college's class conditions are reflected in the state of the physical plant and the experience of it, the phenomenology of class, gender, and race life on campus. In other words, what real college learning looks, sounds, and feels like. So this is the air shaft outside the English department offices. This is a tree that's grown. This is again pre-pandemic. A colleague of mine used a picture, not this photo, but a picture of this on her book about teaching composition and rhetoric at my college. We tell the stories, we need to tell the stories of the conditions of the people we meet at our colleges. Our students' gender embodiments and their homelessness and their children and their hunger. And here, unfortunately, is a typical dinner scene at CSI. Telling our class history for faculty means telling the stories of our empty office hours or our overfull office hours, where we lose track of the overwork of race, the overwork of being the one Latinx faculty member, to use Lorgia Garcia Pena's term in her new book, Community as Rebellion. Garcia Pena's under-resourced work in Latinx studies happened, by the way, at Harvard. And here's another important race, class, gender, resource contradiction. Thankfully, Garcia Pena has told us that chilling history of the clash, the material clash of resources and brown women's bodies within the colonizing project of the university. As Garcia Pena's history, and as the histories at CSI that I tell each testify, material conditions are never the whole story. But untold, there are a veil that falls across our field and higher education generally, because the backdrop narrative of higher education is about social mobility and the democratizing promise of education, and sometimes that works. But another background story is about the belief in meritocracy, the belief that we deserve to be where we are, that we've earned it. But a sense of belonging, I'll talk more about belonging in a bit, a sense of belonging that stakes its claim on meritocracy is perhaps the biggest class contradiction in higher education. It's so easy, as my former colleague Sarah Schulman has told me many times, to mistake what is recognizable for what is deserving. Further, a belief in the meritocracy myth blinds those who feel deserving to other inequalities, writes Natasha Waraku in The Diversity Bargain. Far from despairing, I want to be heard as saying, telling these complicated stories could more deeply connect the class-disconnected field of queer studies. It is in part through our complicated class relations that we have ways forward, ways to connect and even integrate our work in queer studies across our class divides. I believe that we still have so much to discover about the material construction of queer academic thought, much to discover about the connective tissue of class within our field. So why might we not be queerly tuned into, and as is so important in queer studies, queerly turned on by the prospect of telling the material histories of our field? Because ideas, including queer ideas, often hide their class-based histories. So you'll notice a slippage here, a slippery non-agentive subject doing the hiding in that sentence. And that's because I don't want to fixate on the claim that scholars intentionally hide the receipts for their ideas. Yes, sometimes we do tend to hide our personal class backgrounds. We see, for example, class quietude among academics from the working class. Silence about their class roots, in fact, is a defining feature of working class academic narratives. Wealthy academics are, in their own way, also sometimes tight-lipped about their class status. But scholars don't always intentionally hide the class constructedness of our ideas. Rather, the process of field formation sometimes does that for us. Rachel Sagna-Burma and Laura Hefner explore one version of this disappearing act in their new book, The Teaching Archive, A New History for Literary Study, where they argue that classrooms, including working class classrooms, are the places where some of our most important theories and methods for literary study have been made by teachers and students together. Yet those histories have been overwritten because, they say, histories of the discipline of English almost invariably take the scholarship of professors working at a handful of elite universities as evidence of the main line of the discipline's theories and practices. Burma and Heffernan give us good work to do, saying we should restore a full material history to the ephemeral hours we spend in the classroom. I want to offer another example of the ways material histories can get hidden by ideas, and I couldn't very well come to Duke without talking about basketball. I'm from Indiana. One of the best and most underappreciated resources in queer studies is a delightfully old school website created and maintained by John Grimes Younger, an emeritus professor from the University of Kansas. But before Younger went to the University of Kansas, he was an openly gay professor at Duke University. Some of you may know him. One of you may have his office. This website is great. It's basically a list with some links of all the queer studies courses and programs that you can find. You can also find a link in this site to Younger's autobiography titled My First 74 Years. And if you read that, you will see him write, in 1988, I began studying feminism. It was then unusual for men to identify as feminists, but Duke had won the NCAA basketball championship for 2 years, and departments received money to hire exceptional faculty. The English department hired the queer theorist E. Sedgwick, who moved into the office next to me. So Sedgwick moved around a lot, and I just would think, what are the stories of the people who Sedgwick moved next to when she moved to the university? How lucky would you be? In these few sentences by Younger, we see a very queer funding story, or to say it the other way around, a very material queer theory story about Sedgwick coming to Duke. Now, Younger's story of Sedgwick's arrival is a very different story than the one that I had heard. That story goes, Stanley Fish went on a mission to transform the English department at Duke into a theory powerhouse. And he hired Sedgwick, among other dazzling theorists, to do that. And I have to suppose that story is somewhat true. It's certainly recognizable. But Younger's rendering of theorists coming to Duke turns not only on the enticing power of theory to reshape academia, but also on the revenue from a basketball game. Let's say that there's some truth to each of these stories. And let's also observe that it is only the story of big ideas, not the story of Coach K being a queer theory sugar daddy. That's my one quotable. That tends to get told. It's thinkable, I'm suggesting, that the high-profile project of gathering idea makers in one place so that that place becomes synonymous with idea making contains some very queer material relations. Such material histories do not undercut or cheapen our queer theories. They reflect the conditions of possibility for our queer theories. The title of my talk is, We Should Bring Her Here. And though I just told a story of Sedgwick being brought to Duke, and while in Poor Queer Studies, I told a longer and different version of the story of Sedgwick's arduous journey to Duke, the her in my title is not Sedgwick. Rather, I overheard this line at a gathering of queer studies scholars, spoken by one professor from a rich queer studies school to their colleagues from the same school. Now that sentence, we should bring her here, can mean several things at the same time. It can mean we would be lucky to be able to work with this person and more immediately see our ideas in the context of hers, and we'd be lucky to have our students work with her. Or the should could reflect the soft mandate of usual practice, the mundane expectation of service work. This is our job. This is something to do. We should bring her here. Will you join the search committee? Or it could mean, let's hire her away. Let's poach her. Let's consolidate the field here through her hire. All possible meaning. What we don't need to guess about is the pattern of faculty exchange at work behind this queer scene. We can confidently predict that the speaker, the we, and the object of the sentence, her, were at institutions of equal prestige, or that the potential hire was trained at a more prestigious graduate school. I offered anecdotal evidence, but it fits within the broad material history of faculty exchange in higher education, as shown by a new study, which uses a wealth of data about faculty hiring practices between 2011 and 2020. That study confirms we have a top-down problem in the academy, including queer studies. So this is a visual from that study on the right. The big idea is that faculty placement power is highly concentrated among a small set of universities that already have enormous power because they produce the most PhDs. And that together, these patterns create network structures characterized by a closely connected core of high prestige universities that exchange faculty with each other and export faculty to, but rarely import them from universities in the network periphery. What this means is that overwhelmingly the flow of faculty is down the prestige hierarchy. Outside of the top tier, which hires faculty almost exclusively from itself, institutions hire faculty from above, and faculty accept jobs below, creating a downward flow of faculty exchange. So in this graphic, you can't see very well, but around the outside of the circle are different arcs, and those each represent a different department. This is gender studies. You can look through 107 different disciplines when you go to this study at the Larimore lab. They've done the visuals, the big data visuals. The blue chords connect schools from which one faculty, a PhD, was hired to another school. The blue chords represent faculty moving from a higher prestige university to a lower prestige university. The red chords represent faculty who move from a lower prestige university to a higher prestige university. Now you do see some red chords, but this is a picture of blue. This is a picture of faculty moving down the academic hierarchy. Why does this matter? By the way, it's like this in every discipline. The humanities actually hires the fewest people up the hierarchy. Humanities is one of the most hierarchical of the disciplines. Why does this matter? The downward dynamic is one of the ways that ideas made at a small number of schools become self-reinforcing and, at the same time, dominant throughout academia. New PhDs disproportionately produced above, but whom the top schools can't accommodate within their own tenure track ranks, take the ideas, texts, protocols, methods, pedagogies, the names, the relationships, the expectations, the reputations with them as they move down. And this is one way queer theory expands across the academy. It becomes very important, given this structure of influence, to ask what class-based conditions and assumptions help construct the knowledge being disseminated across the different university locations. We can ask what I call crossover questions. How well does queer studies prepare its faculty to move down the class hierarchy after graduation? How well does the field prepare faculty to reconceptualize the queer ideas made under one set of material circumstances, when and if, likely, they find themselves in quite another set of class and race educational circumstances? What cross-class pedagogies and methods ought graduate training introduce to queer studies teachers and scholars? And finally, who would be the most able to teach those pedagogies and methods, to set cross-class expectations, and to ingrain the importance of relating to and relating from less prestigious work sites? I'm trying to give shape here to the impulse of queer fairing, the term that I ended Poor Queer Studies with. The gesture in that book's epilogue still seems right to me, but that book ended with me thinking there's so much cross-class work to do. But then something happened. Sometimes you get what you ask for. Just at the time the Poor Queer Studies came out at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, I started to see a trickle and then a flood, what felt like a flood, of my faculty colleagues at the College of Staten Island and from around the CUNY system leaving their jobs, getting hired away from other schools, to use that loaded language, getting hired away by much more prestigious schools, getting hired away by much richer schools, quarter schools. I had previously taken issue with a sentence pertinent to this discussion that is attributed to Sedgwick. She apparently said, "You can write your way out of anywhere." And Sedgwick, in fact, did write her way out of a lot of places. She was brilliant enough to do that. Still, I wish that one of our luminaries had not said that, for almost all of the evidence says it is not true. The evidence says that if you start writing at the top, you may get lucky enough to stay at the top, but probably not. Basically, none who start from below the middle of the grad school prestige hierarchy move up, certainly not to the top, and neither does their knowledge. And yet, there was this new evidence happening all around me, without me even looking for it. Faculty were moving from CSI to Columbia, from CSI to Northwestern, from CSI to NYU. These are friends of mine, colleagues with whom I worked closely for many years, many of whom worked in queer studies or women's studies or Black studies or lesbian studies or climate studies. These were almost all tenured faculty and many full professors, people who had long histories at CUNY. These are people that I know to be fully committed to the CUNY mission of serving the children of the whole people of New York, as the saying goes. And they were, and they are, leaving. More to the point, they are moving up. And so I started thinking that maybe Sedgwick was right. Maybe you can write your way out of anywhere. Maybe there's been a disruption in the academic caste system. So I want to pause here to say that I'm thrilled for my former colleagues. They deserve great professional things, and I think that their moves are really good decisions, though not easy ones. And I also don't blame the schools that hired them. I would hire them too. Sometimes faculty at CUNY and elsewhere do not have the resources they need to do their important work. In those situations, we can become incredibly innovative. We learn to adjust and recalibrate and make it work, but sometimes intellectual projects that we desperately need in the world can only advance when faculty move elsewhere. I just saw a report about NC State really undervaluing its Black faculty and that they're jumping ship. Such moves, it seems to me, are terribly important to make. That said, it is noteworthy when faculty move from poor schools to rich ones because such moves reverse the nearly unstemmed flow down the academic hierarchy. It is also true that when resources are redistributed upward in the academy, the college left behind is often harmed. To understand that harm, we need to remember that rich and poor study schools are not only occupy different class positions in the academy, but that they exist much more intimately than we know in class relation to each other. It is clearly bad for CUNY when we lose seasoned faculty who have gained extraordinary experience teaching poor and working class students, poor students of color, first-gen students, the educational outsiders that make up our student body at CUNY. But that harm is multiplied when the institutions that hire them are the elitist universities that refuse to serve the representative numbers of poor students who could benefit precisely from the new faculty members' expertise teaching with and working with poor students. Now, the rich students of these new schools may benefit, and that is important. But the upward redistribution of poor queer faculty is not helpful when poor pedagogies are not encouraged and recognized. If class quietude is normalized by the administration, if there's not material and microcultural support for maintaining the faculty members' cross-class professional bonds with the school she left. Of course, she'll maintain her affective bonds, but what about the material bonds that help create the field of poor queer students? How will she maintain them when material conditions change? And how will her new school help her do that? How will they both bring her here and not? Of course, what I'm saying is that the upward redistribution of resources, these very valuable, very human resources, could be a way of working our class relation into a field, of working the class stratifying system against itself by elaborating and deepening our relations when faculty move up. We should bring her here might, I'm saying, be heard as an invitation to do just that, to weave our different queer studies material histories into a layered but common story that doesn't reinstall an aspirational narrative, but keeps looking down. The choice of her might even be made very intentionally with such a cross-class invitation to share in mind. I pause only briefly to add the contradiction that she might find such an invitation not only unrecognizable, but recognized unwanted. She might, understandably, just want to write her way out. I want to make one final point about the harm that comes from the upward redistribution of poor queer studies faculty. This table shows the 6-year trend of faculty at the College of Staten Island from 2016 to 21. I want to draw your attention to the number of assistant professors we had in 2016. 110. It's a little small up here, so I've written it in red at the bottom. In 2016, we had 110 assistant professors. In 2021, we had 49 assistant professors. In 2016, we had a total of 358 tenure track faculty. In 2021, we had 309. These numbers reveal that when faculty leave my college, people who have been my poor queer studies, poor women's and gender studies, co-authors, interlocutors, collaborators, role models, dear friends, when they leave, not only are they not replaceable as cherished colleagues, but they are not replaced. What I didn't consider before the pandemic, though obviously it was happening, is that if one of the wishes of poor queer studies came true, that is, if elitist hiring networks opened up so that scholars truly could write their way out of anywhere, then paradoxically, the possibility of doing poor queer studies and sharing it across the academy would be diminished because ways into poor queer studies schools are being cut off. Their tenure track lines are not being renewed. There are fewer and fewer poor queer studies faculty who can share from there. I'm just going to put up CSI's institutional profile. One name for this relationship dynamic, where wealth depletes resources from communities and leaves them poor or poorer, is extraction. The material histories of our queer class locations are linked, yours and mine, are linked by that dynamic of extraction. And again, this is not to throw into question the good sense it makes to hire my colleagues, or the good sense it makes for them to lead CSI. It is to recognize our connectedness within a system in which up makes down, in which hoarding depletes. That is an intimate relation. And I would like to think that it is even more intimate for queer studies. I would like to think that it can be even more intimate because we're queers. But that is only sometimes true. That same dynamic of extraction, of up making down in and through higher education, manifests in many ways. Devarian L. Baldwin, in his book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Plunder Our Cities, details the ways higher ed exerts, these are his words, an increasingly powerful hold over our cities and those who struggle to survive in its shadows. And the lower income neighborhoods and communities of color that stand in the immediate path of campus expansion, while in deep need of new investments, are left the most vulnerable. I can't imagine what that story would look like when you apply Baldwin's analytic to Duke University in Durham. In the face of class and race sorting, in the face of ideas hiding their class histories, in the face of the extractive relationship by which poor queer studies resources are redistributed up to rich queer studies schools, it is in the face of all that we can think, that it is possible to think about the work of building cross-class, redistributive, sharing relationships as a queer method for restructuring the field of queer studies. This cross-class work can be how our field gets reimagined. It is something we can do, a practice and a protocol for making queer knowledge in the university. That is, queer studies can be reimagined not only in terms of what it is about, which is a really interesting and productive and propulsive question, but in terms of the redistributive methods that precondition the work of figuring out what the field can be about. I believe we're at a point where we may soon, if we follow the data trends, no longer be able to see each other across our institutional class divides. It's so hard to do now. And unless we better understand the queer class relations of our work. I think others believe that too. I think that is why I am here today, because somebody at Duke believes that too. want to close with a few words about belonging in the field of queer studies. And I do that by way of revisiting some of my attachments to the field and my material history with the room we're in today. I've been in this room before, and being in a room is one huge reason that one enters a room again. Queer studies is a field constituted by its explicit embrace of the desire to study for good. This is my paraphrase of one of Robin Weidman's ideas in her 2012 book, Object Lessons, a book that has been incredibly important to me over the years, especially as I have thought about belonging in the field of queer studies. Sharing in the field's desire for social justice and pursuing that aim through disciplinary practices, including working with the field's objects or shaped concerns, constitutes belonging in the field. Perhaps even more, the hope that it will somehow work, that disciplinary practice will translate into justice, says Weidman, and I agree, not only sets fields like queer studies apart, but produces what I think of in my reworking of Weidman as an affective threshold of belonging in the field. At our tender moments in the academy, and you can take your pick of them, we especially need to feel included. Object Lessons did that for me, and there are surely texts that each of us can name without which we would not have thought to feel like we belong in this room. Working with these texts, we cross over the affective threshold. We feel, at least partially, at least for a little while, attached. Now I think is a good time to ask, what would it look like to put material resources alongside affective attachments in the story of how we've come to belong or not in the field of queer studies? We would need to imagine a material threshold operating alongside or in relation to an affective threshold of belonging. Toward that end, we could consider the field of working class studies in relation to queer studies. This is not because one of these fields, they're not because they're in opposition, one aligned with the material and one aligned with the affective, but the two are never distinct or not entwined. But rather, the relation of working class studies to queer studies, or more precisely, queer theory, is apt because these two fields have similar timestamps. Though class studies has a long history, working class studies, sometimes called the new working class studies, was reconstituted as such in the 1990s, just at the moment queer theory coalesced under its new disciplinary sign. One of the most striking, and I would argue defining differences between these fields is their class and status-based institutional affiliations. The Center for Working Class Studies was started in 1996 at Youngstown State University. Queer theory, as Gabriel mentioned earlier, of course, was born at Duke and other early institutions. Though other identity-centered fields have different higher education footprints, none leave so little a trace as does working class studies at well-resourced colleges. It's going to take 2 more minutes. Working class studies constructs its objects in places that do not map neatly onto the places of queer studies, even though overlaps exist. Its institutions are harder to see, its scholars easier to overlook, its knowledge base, as reflected in the institutions of the editorial collective of the Journal of Working Class Studies, exists to a significant extent outside selective and high-profile academic institutions and beyond the North American system of scholarly production, largely in the UK and Australia, still within the global North. The bibliography of the field-defining 2021 Routledge International Handbook of Working Class Studies also locates the gravitational center of that field at institutions that serve working class students and that hire faculty from the working classes. Working class objects also look different. The organization's aforementioned Journal of Note, the Journal of Working Class Studies, published its first issue in 2016 and is not only peer-reviewed, but open access, an important material commitment not met by journals such as GLQ. With 1 foot now in the field, I realized that working class studies leaves just such material traces as well as affective ones, on the objects it creates. And this is true, of course, for all fields. And so the question is, what are the material traces of queer studies objects? The hope that our desire to study for good will actually do good goes a long way. There is an affective bond that can be said to hold in tension disparate places of queer studies. The affective bond operates as a threshold of inclusion in the field, but I think this affective bond is weakening, perhaps is already broken, as the academy becomes ever more class stratified and race sorted, and as scholars become in turn ever more disconnected by the starkly different material conditions of our work lives. When our theories fail to hold our disciplines together because our class-located places of study are flying so violently apart, from what intellectual position will we create new knowledge for each other? What acts of recognition can materially include those other readers without whom Weekman tells us our words have no meaning? Maybe this is one of those double binds that queer theory is so famous for. But surely not all double binds are forever. We can adjudicate our way out of some of them by, in this case, maybe finding practical and impractical ways to redistribute resources around the university. What Yvette Taylor and Chiranjeet Mann and I did from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, what we call queer sharing in the Marketized University, and the collection that's coming out next month. There's a lot that can be done within a bad structure when we use our desire and our material resources. We can share, we can desire sharing, and we can share. Thank you so much.